In this video, we will explain what the rule of a Grub is, the differences between the Grub 1 and Grub 2 versions. We're going to explain the interactive selections you can make at boot, how to install Grub, explain how the configuration files that Grub needs are used and modified. Okay, let's begin. What is Grub? Virtually all x86-based Linux systems outside of the embedded sphere today use Grub, Grand Unified Bootloader, to handle the early phases of a system startup. Other platforms may have other equivalents, such as ELI/LO, used on EFI systems such as IA64, Itanium, and DAS U-boot used on many embedded configurations. Some important features of Grubs are alternative operating systems can be chosen at boot time. Alternative kernels and or initial RAM disks can be chosen at boot time for a given operating system. Boot parameters can be easily changed at the boot time without having to edit configuration files, etc. in advance. Version 2 has replaced version 1 on all major Linux distributions except for Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6 based ones. Grub versions. Well, details are different between Grub 2 and the legacy version 1. The basic philosophy is the same. At boot, a basic configuration file is read. Boot grub, grub.config, or boot grub2, grub.config, or boot EFI, Red Hat grub.config. This file is auto-generated by update grub or grub2 mkconfig based on configuration files in the etc grub.d directory and on etc default grub and should not be edited by hand. Usually, these utilities are run from other distribution supplied scripts used for updating or compiling Linux kernels. Once again, the file is better off not being edited by hand. However, if you do make changes, most of the time they will be preserved. Interactive selections with the Grub boot. Upon system boot, after the initial post and BIOS stages, Grub will be entered and display a manual containing a list of bootable images, either from one or more Linux distributions or operating systems. There may also be sub-menus with even more choices. Using up and down arrows and the enter key, you can select the right boot option or can wait for a configurable time period before the default choice is entered. However, you can do much more. After selecting an entry, you can tap E for edit and then enter into an interactive shell. In this shell, you can alter the stanza in a configuration file that describes the particular boot option. Usually, you do this to alter the kernel command line. For example, adding the word single at the end of the command line will cause the system to boot in single use mode in order to take a corrective action. Once the desired change is made, you can hit the right key to make the system boot. Though it is also possible to enter a pure shell rather than edit a particular stanza. You can run a number of different commands and even try to reinstall or repair Grub, right? If there are serious problems like not being able to find a configuration file, Grub reverts back to this command line mode and you may be able to rescue the system without resorting to rescue media. Installing Grub. The word installing can have several different meanings with respect to Grub. The meaning number one, installing the Grub program and associated utilities in their proper locations. In Grub 1, there was actually a program just called Grub, but in Grub 2, there are a bunch of utilities with names like Grub 2 or Grub dash *risk. How they are packaged is rather distribution dependent. Two, installing the files Grub needs to operate at boot time under either boot Grub or boot Grub 2. This is to separate them, the files the Linux kernel needs, VM Linux, and init fs, right? Which will need to be in the boot directory as well. Three, installing Grub as the bootloader in a system. Usually this is done at the front of the entire hard disk, but can also be done in a partition. If you do not install Grub during system installation or you need to reinstall at some later point, the exact procedure for doing so depends on the Grub version. For version 2, the installation procedure can be as easy as sudo grub to install dev SDA. Please read the man page carefully before running such a command. There are many options, and messing up Grub can make your system unbootable. Note on EFI multi-boot systems, you may have to also run EFI boot manager as things can be more complex, right? You can see the man page for more details. Grab device nomenclature. In both Grab versions, the first hard drive is denoted as the HD0, the second one is the HD1, etc. However, in version 1, partitions start counting from 0, and in version 2, from 1. You can check on the screen, right? There are no need to emphasize that getting confused about this can be rather destructive. Both versions of the Grab sometimes use the SDA hash notation and sometimes use a HD0 comma hash, so it can get further confusing. Within a configuration file, each stanza has to specify what the root partition is. This is not the same as what we mean when we talk about the root directory of the system. In this context, it means the partition contains the kernel itself. In a boot directory, for example, it is very common to have a boot in its own partition. Let's say dev SDA1. It is also fine to do kernel HD00 VM Linux. Instead, and leave out the root line, right? A quick look at the grub.config should make it clear. Grub configuration files. Remember that you should not edit boot grub.config or boot grub to grub.config directly. For grub2, there are two locations in the etc directory that should require attention and are used to reconstruct grub.config. Whenever the system is altered with the new kernels or relevant updating programs such as update grub or grub by is manually run, right? Bootloader specification configuration BLSCFG on systems configured with BLSCFG. One still uses the usual grub command when installing or updating kernels, etc. When booting, one will still see the same interactive grub screen and use it as it has always been done. However, some differences are important. For example, while boot grub2 grub.config still exists, detailed information and options for each kernel that can be chosen does not appear there. It is in bootloader entries, one file for each choice. It is possible to switch to the new scheme by running the grub2 switch to BLS CFG program. One can also turn the new method and on and off by altering the variable grab enable BLSFG s equal to true or false, right? For example, you can see on the screen that's on the Red Hat Enterprise Linux A system, you can get the grab information over there. Bootloader entries with the bootloader specification configuration scheme. Each possible kernel gains an entry in bootloader entries. A number of the environmental variables may be set in boot grub to grub env, including kernel ops, tune init rd, tune params, grub users. Boot grub to grub env also sets the default boot kernel, right? Okay, this is the end of this video. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.